Chapter 1. Bitterer than the knowledge that his father had died in prison, was Rip's discovery that well-meaning men had unwittingly aided the unknown plotters who had framed Ira. Rip aided them by not telling of a few trivialities which hid the truth. And now, the plotters had a new victim picked and ready. Rip pushed open the swing doors, stepped inside, stopped and stood motionless. His tall, black-garbed figure was filmed with dust. Dust darkened his blonde hair and streaked his tired face. His features had lost their fresh look of youth in these past 12 months. He had put on a dozen years in the last 10 days. It seemed a long time he had been away. The big room had gone very still. Behind the bar, gaunt-bodied Cal Queen gently set down the whiskey bottle he had just opened. At the end of the bar Rick Zachary leaned, his genial sun-leathered visage concerned, his intense blue eyes waiting and anxious. At the bar, at the gaming tables, at the various customers, especially Sam Wright, were quite as openly concerned, as silently waiting. Only one man moved. Martin Thomas, for 7 years now the house man at the Black Jack, the only square gambler a good many men in Salt Lake had ever known, started to move forward, a hand half raised in greeting. He did not look toward Zachary, but the immobility of the whole room caught him. He too went still, slowly lowering his hand. In that blanket of silence, that concentrated regard eloquent with an almost embarrassing welcome, with a grim championship none of these men could put into words, Rip forced his reluctant feet on, not toward the bar, but along the wall. 30 pairs of eyes watched him, helpless. He stopped before a document draped with crepe. The crepe was faded and dusty now, a year ago it had been black and clean. A muscle bunched in Rip's jaw as he read the familiar lines and remembered tough old Bobby Harris, because of whom his father, Ira Rip, and his brother, Barry Rip, had died. The yellowing document read: "To whom it may concern, this is to certify that Rick Zachary has on this day loaned me the sum of $26,000 bucks. As security for so generous a loan I hereby make him silent partner in my beloved saloon, which is to become his sole property in case it ever proves impossible for me to pay back his loan, signed. Bob Harris witness. Cal Queen." Rip turned away, his dirt-streaked features blank of all expression. He went toward the bar, stopped and stood there, looking around at familiar faces, still stripped bare of speech, of even the impulse to bring sound out of his throat. Queen wordlessly shoved toward him the open bottle and a clean glass. Thomas stood at his elbow and raised a hand to grip the boy's shoulder, saying nothing. Sam Wright smiled a little diffidently and took a step toward him. Rick Zachary spoke the first word, his heavy voice subdued. "You needn't say anything, son, we heard. You just get back?" Rip nodded, and reached for the whiskey bottle. "You on your way after Dave Holly, boy?" Thomas asked. "Yeah." Sam Wright said, "You want any help?" "Every damn man here." Rip cut in. "I'll go alone, I owe Dad and Barry that. Holly put the bullets in him. You better take some of us along, boy. Dave shoots in the back. At least, let me and Martin," Wright protested. Rip cut him off. "I'll go alone. Thanks, but I'll go alone." He emptied a second glass of whiskey. The silence, the immobility, held sway again. Most of them had known Rip all his life, these men gathered about him. They had known his father, his mother and his brother, as they had known the girl he loved, Cat O'Hara, and Cat's mother, black-haired acid-tongued old Meg, as they had known the wide lands of the Rip home acres, the quarter-circle star. They did not like the picture they were seeing in their mind's eye, of young Rip prone, a bullet hole between his shoulder blades. Sam Wright, whose holdings were just over Star Hill from the Rip place, cleared his throat and made another try. "Listen, kid, you won't have a dog's chance with that treacherous son of a." Rip wheeled from the bar. "It's no use talking, Sam. It's my fight, I'll still take it alone." He went out through a silence as profound as that in which he had entered, his black figure like a shadow moving toward the swing doors. The late sun, slanting through the front windows, gleamed on the mica-flecked dust powdering his shoulders, on the falling specks of sawdust kicked up by his lifting heels. The doors shut behind him. They saw him rise to the saddle on the rangy long-legged sorrel they knew, heard the horse's hoofs beat a retreat beyond their sight. The silence shattered. Sam Wright brought his hand flat down on the bar. "By Judas, I'm going after him. We've had enough killing out of Dave Holly. He shot Ira and Barry just because he wanted all the loot himself, plugged Bobby Harris and Joe Willoughby just because they'd have seen him from the stage and could identify him. He ain't going to add Rip to his list. I'm going after that kid. Rick Zachary's voice was not subdued now. It rattled the windows. You'll stay right where you are, Sam Wright. That boy's took enough, and I reckon this is a show. He told us to keep out, and we're doing as he asks. Have you forgot that Mike Dillon and all the rest of the boys are still right there on the quarter circle start aside him? Wright subsided. I guess I was forgetting that for the minute, Rick. You're right, as usual, we'll stay out, till he calls us in. Martin Thomas said soberly. If only he doesn't call too late. Chapter 2. The dusk was deepening into night as Rip rode the sorrel down the lane and turned into the barnyard. He stepped from the saddle, dropped the reins over the horse's head to the ground, and started across the yard toward the back porch of the big house. The light in the kitchen window was a defiant challenge. He wondered if Dave Holly really could still be there. Would Dave have the sheer cold nerve to dare still be there? Was the light in the window a leering bluff, and Dave warned and gone long ago? Rip stopped at the foot of the porch steps, listening, his right hand mechanically resting on the butt of the gun in his holster. No sound came from inside. Rip went swiftly up the treads, crossed the porch, flung open the door, and walked boldly into the familiar room. Dave Holly was still there. He was over against the wall, across the kitchen, facing Rip, gagged, bound, and tied into a chair. He was a thin man, a little over medium height, good-looking in a gaunt, rugged fashion. Holly wasn't very good-looking at the moment, his graying hair disheveled, his face battered and bloody. He had been severely beaten not too long since. Pinned to his breast was a scrap of paper with writing on it. The roughly printed words were large. Rip could read them easily from where he stood. Here he is waiting for you, Rip, the rat who killed your big brother and framed your old man into the pen. Nobody will ever ask what you did with him. We believe in justice. The Vigilantes. Holly sat hunched in his bonds. He had never been a coward at any time in his 45 years, but there was undisguised terror in his straining eyes now, eyes half closed by the puffing flesh around them. Holly knew well, as everyone on Salt Lick Range knew, how Rip had revered old Ira and the older boy Barry. He knew how stunned Rip had been by the tragedy, how wildly Rip had sworn vengeance and vowed to get back the quarter circle star, the ranch that had been owned by Rips for 3 generations, that was now legal and legitimate property of Dave Holly. Everyone on the range knew also how, 10 days ago, the prison authorities had sent for Rip, saying that the old man was dying. They knew that the old man had died swearing it was Dave Holly who had framed the robbery evidence on him and killed Barry. They knew that Rip was returning to the Salt Lick Range today. As he stood there, looking down into Holly's battered face, Rip suddenly knew a few things himself. He knew that Dave fully expected to die within the next few minutes, knew that the terror in Holly's eyes was not craven, yellow, it was rebellious. As men often do in moments of terror show upon their faces some desperate emotion from deep within, some emotion that cannot possibly be any dissembling, so now such an emotion claimed all of Holly's bruised and bloody features. Rip stared, mouth half open, locked into immobility by sheer incredulity. Then the moment of incredulity was gone, and he knew. Not from any man's tongue would he have believed what he read in Dave Holly's face. He could believe what he saw with his own eyes. I know. He whipped the gag from Holly's mouth and bent over him. I know. You didn't do it. No, Holly whispered with dry lips. No, son. I didn't do it. Rip started untying the bonds. The old man thought it was you. But it was somebody else, framing you. That's right. Somebody dressed in your clothes, Rip said slowly, riding your horse. And, of course, you've always known it. That's right, boy. How did you know? Why, how could I help but know? My horse was gone that night, my clothes had been taken. They was all brought back in the morning before I got up. The horse was caked with dried sweat and mud, the mackinaw and shirt dirty and bloody. What did you do with 'em, Dave? Burned the clothes, son. Cleaned up my horse and sold him to a drifter bound for Mexico. Holly flexed his cramped arms and legs as Rip removed the last thing. Ever since then, every hour, every day, I've been expecting your old man to bust out and accuse me. Why didn't he ever do it before? Why did he say at the trial that he didn't know who done it? Why did he break down now, at the end, and blurt out what he thought was the truth? Rip dropped wearily into the nearest kitchen chair, and rubbed a hand across his forehead. He knew the state I was in, Dave, knew if he told then, I'd sure go on the prod after you, get into trouble and maybe get myself killed. He figured the sheriff would catch up with you, with the one bandit who, supposedly, got away. He told you that? Yeah. But when he realized he was dying, figuring I'd cooled down enough now to leave it to the law, he thought the law ought to know the bandit was you. Being as the law hadn't caught up with the fella in a year now, Holly said, and it had begun to look as if they never would. Yeah. What did the old man die of, Rip? The chest wounds he got that night of the holdup, coupled with pneumonia. The blood on your shirt was Barry's blood, Dave, it's on some man's hands. And now the old man's life is on that fellow's hands too. If it hadn't been for the old wounds, the old man would have pulled through? Yeah. The prison doc said so. And I'd have had a chance to clear him and get him out of there. Rip sat silent, remembering the night of the robbery, when the incoming stage had been held up by 3 masked men. The masked men had gotten the box of money off the stage. Then there had been a gun battle, 2 of the bandits had dropped, the 3rd had ridden off, the stage had raced away. Harris and Willoughby, passengers in the stage, had been shot to death, the stage driver and the guard wounded badly. In the morning, the sheriff and his posse had found 2 masked men lying in the brush at the scene of the holdup, Barry Rip, dead, and old Ira Rip unconscious but still alive. Later, Ira Rip had told a wild story. He had, he said, been going home from town with Barry, neither of them armed. A masked man had held them up, forced them at the point of the gun to ride to the scene of the holdup, then had shot them down from behind, after ordering them to turn their backs to him. That was the last the old man had remembered until he regained consciousness in the sheriff's office. Nobody had ever believed that story, but Rip, and Cat O'Hara. Holly's voice drew Rip back to the present. But now, dying, Ira admitted that he'd seen enough that night to recognize my black and yellow striped shirt, my black and white plaid mackinaw, and my blaze face black with the 4 white stockings. Rip said, "It's a good thing you were wise enough to burn the clothes and get rid of the horse." Holly smiled thinly. After word had already got all over town what had happened, when the stage came in. Hell, son. The minute I found that mackinaw and shirt, stuffed under my bunk, and got a look at my horse, I knew what the score was. I'd been pretty drunk the night before, I was sleeping it off. I wasn't supposed to discover them things, the sheriff was, when he went combing the town buildings and houses for possible clues. And there wasn't another man around Salt Lick who wore a black and white plaid mackinaw, or a striped shirt like that one. There wasn't another black mark like yours on Salt Lick Range. Rip got to his feet and started pacing restlessly. Who did that to you, tonight, Dave? Beat you up, tied you in that chair and gagged you? I don't know, boy. They wore kerchiefs over their faces, just had holes in 'em for eyes. Only 2 of them spoke, I didn't know their voices. He added with a wry smile, or their clothes. How many of them were there? 6. They said you'd be coming after me, hog wild, said they were going to fix me so I couldn't run. And you put up a fight. That I did. Don't I look like it? Slightly. Were you going to run, Dave? Hell, yes. From me, or the sheriff? Both. What chance would I have, once I was jailed, with your old man spilling the kind of evidence against me? How many men do you think would be ready to swear that I never wore that mackinaw or shirt since that night? Rip whistled under his breath. Half of Salt Lick. I could swear it myself, now that my attention has been called to it. You and everybody else, Holly said grimly. They've got me in a tight. I was going to duck and lie low until you cooled off, or some evidence could be dug up in my favor. The news had only just got around, via the party line. I was all ready to make a fast getaway when them 6 birds busted in on me. And one of those 6 buzzards, or more, killed Barry and the old man and robbed the stage, Rip said. You realize that, don't you? Nobody else would have been that much interested in seeing me drill a couple of holes in you. He stopped and stood thinking, an odd expression growing on his face. Holly said, What's biting you? I was just thinking, Dave. My horse was tired, I took it pretty slow, coming out. 6 men from town, with fresh horses, could have circled me and got here ahead of me, easy. He was recalling with sharp clarity Sam Wright's insistent argument that he needed help to go after Dave Holly. Only too easily, Sam could have slipped out of the saloon, with 5 other men, and hit for the quarter circle star. Rick, Zachary and Mongo Thomas would have had no chance to stop them, once the men had gone out of the Black Jack swing doors. Holly said, Sure. They could have. And where does that get us? I still have to hide, the sheriff will be after me pronto. It's funny he hasn't shown up before this. Rip turned to face him, eyes gone hard. No. You're not going to run, Dave. The best place for you to hide is in the county jail with John Lander keeping guard over you. And that's where you're going, that's where we're both going, straight to Sheriff Lander for you to give yourself up. Holly jerked himself erect, almost spilling out of his chair. Like hell I am. I wouldn't have a chance. You will after I get through talking to John Lander. Leave that to me, you'll hole up safe in a cell and let those buzzards think they've gotten away with it. And while Sheriff Lander is taking everybody's attention with his monkey shines, I'll be tracking down the polecats that tried to frame you. Holly stared, suspicion flashing into his eyes. I don't like this, Rip. What are you trying to pull? Rip looked back at him steadily. How do you come to own this ranch, Dave? Why did I put it on the block, holding it so dirt cheap that it would have to sell quick? Why was I ready to let some other man buy everything I owned, lock, stock and barrel, at half its worth? Why was I willing to give up everything right when Kat and I were going to be married? Holly said slowly, to lay your hands on some ready cash to fight the case for your old man. And your expensive lawyer spent it all for you, and lost the case, he didn't have a chance, either. I see what you mean. Rip said, and do you think I'm going to take it lying down now? Let my father and my brother go unavenged? Let another innocent man suffer for the crime? Let the real killers go riding around the country scot-free? Holly said, No. No, I guess not. But what can you do? I don't know, till I get started. But they'll never hang you for something you didn't do, Dave, believe me. Holly sighed wearily. Okay. I guess it's the best cover-up you could have to work behind, at that. All right, son. I'll go with you to the sheriff. They went out of the house and started down the steps, and Rip caught the glimmer of bunkhouse lights through the branches of the cottonwood grove. And the odd thing occurred to him then, a thing that caused his skin to crawl and raise the hairs on the back of his neck. The bunkhouse in the cottonwoods. 6 cowboys in the bunkhouse. He remembered what Mike Dillon, the foreman, had said to him when the quarter circle star had passed into Dave Holly's hands. I guess we'll just stay on, Rip. Not that we've any particular liking for Dave Holly, but all of us been here a long time. The quarter circle star is home. I guess we'll just hang around and keep an eye on the ranch. Rip followed Holly down the steps and across the yard, his gaze lingering on the lighted windows in the grove. How did it happen that the boys hadn't heard the racket in the kitchen? Could it be possible they hadn't heard? And if they had heard, why hadn't they come rushing to Holly's assistance? 6 cowboys. 6 vigilantes. They might have done a thing like that, you wouldn't hear them using the word loyalty, but they knew what it meant. Still, how could that be the answer? Holly would have known the voices of his own men. Rip was frowning as he went into the barn with Holly to saddle another horse. Something was haywire somewhere, but he wouldn't go out to the bunkhouse and face the boys down, not yet. He could hear Mike Dillon's bull roar of laughter, the nostalgic twang of Skeet's mouth harp. He turned his face away. No, not yet. Get Dave Holly safe in a cell first. Half an hour later Rip and Dave Holly rode down the trail toward the town of Salt Lick together. Less than a mile away from the ranch they met Sheriff Lander on his way to the quarter circle star to pick up Holly. The moon was high now, there was plenty of light for them to see one another. John Lander was a tall, slope-shouldered man with a barrel chest and a melon belly. His thick hair and bushy brows formed sharp white contrast to his red face. His shrewd gray eyes habitually wore a deceptive look of indolent inattention. He drawled mildly, he spoke always as if he were afraid of waking somebody asleep a few feet distant. His gaze played between Rip and Dave Holly as they drew rein confronting him. Well, what you won't see when you ain't got a gun. Holly and Rip riding along like old tillicums. I'd have been here before, only I was out of town when the news broke, Rip said. We were on our way to town, John, Holly's coming in to give himself up. If there was any surprise on Lander's face, it failed to show in the moonlight. He said in his hushed voice, fair enough. Pretty damn smart, too. We ain't never had a mob in Salt Lick yet, this has always been pretty peaceable country. But, we ain't never had a killing like this in Salt Lick before, neither. Everybody's been pretty bad worked up over it. However, we can talk when we get to my office. It was nearly an hour later when they rode the back alleys of Salt Lick to the combined sheriff's office and 2-cell jail. Lander led the way in, lighted the big lamp over his desk, and pulled down the old green blinds over the windows. Then he turned to face the other two, and let his gaze wander lazily over Holly's assorted cuts and bruises. Hell, It looks as if Rip had a little trouble persuading you, Dave. Rip said, I didn't do that, John. Sit down, and let me talk for a few minutes. Lander sat down on the edge of his desk and listened as Rip told all he knew, repeated all Holly had told him. He took the note that had been pinned to Holly's chest out of his pocket and laid it down on the desktop. Lander read it without touching it, then looked up at Holly. Hell, Dave, this here sure is a mixed up mess. What's your idea, Rip? Rip said, it's plain as a haddock on a hook, isn't it, John? 3 men held up the stage, one of them wearing Dave's shirt and mackinaw and riding Dave's horse. When the gun battle broke, 2 of them fell, according to pre-arranged plan, neither of them hurt. After the stage drove off, those 2 simply got up and rode away. Lander said dryly, then the third one rid on, held up Barry and your old man, herded him up there where the stage was held up, plugged him in the back to make it look as if they was shot trying to get away, put masks on him, and rode off to join the other 2. You really believe all this, Rip? Rip said, I have to believe it, I have to believe what Dave says. You have to keep Dave in a cell, and stall along with the trial and give me a chance to prove the truth. Lander raised one hand and rubbed the lobe of his right ear. Oh, I have I? Yes. You see, John, Dad told me something he never told the warden or the prison doc. Yeah? What was that? That he couldn't be sure it was Dave that night. That even though the fellow was wearing Dave's clothes and riding Dave's horse, somehow he felt a mortal doubt of its really being Dave. That's the real reason he never mentioned it before. Rip kept his gaze on Lander, wondering if anything that thin would go down with the sheriff, wondering if Dave would guess that he lied. Lander said, gently, why bring it up now, then? Well, it could be a clue to the real killer, couldn't it, John? That was what Dad thought, it had to be a man about Dave's size and build. Not necessarily, Rip. The man was on a horse, it was night, your old man was bad excited. A mackinaw ain't form-fitting as you might say, could have been a man 3 sizes larger than Dave, but not smaller, hell. Not smaller. Ira would have noticed that. Dad didn't want the bandits to go free, John. He knew none of the 3 had been caught yet. Landers rubbed a hand along his jaw thoughtfully. Hell, boy, you're getting me all mixed up. All along it's looked so dong clear that Ira and Barry and one other man held up the stage, looked like it couldn't be no other way. When the news busted this afternoon, it looked just as clear that Ira had finally give in and squealed on the third man. I still can't see it no other way. I don't blame you none for believing the old man's yarn, but it just don't make no sense, Rip. You're just too stubborn to try to see anything else. Simply because somebody swiped Dave's clothes and horse, Rip said. Lander interrupted. And Dave was damn fast about burning them clothes and getting rid of the horse, hoping nobody would notice it, according to his own tell. If that ain't the action of a guilty man, what is? I told you why he did that, Rip said hotly. He'd heard about the robbery, he knew what would happen to him if those bloody things were found in his cabin. Look here, John. How did that so-called payroll money off the stage get into Dad's and Barry's pockets if they were shot down at the holdup? They'd have had no chance to divide the loot yet. Lander said, well, you remember what Ira said, he didn't know how it got there, said he'd never carried $4,000 on him that way in his life, it must have been planted on him and Barry by the man that shot him. Sounded as loco as all the rest of it, son. The robbers would have had more sense than to do a thing like that, seeing as the third man had rid off with the money box before Ira and Barry was shot down. Hell, Rip. I guess I better tell you where that money come from. Rip stared. You know? Sure I know. Why didn't it come out at the trial then? Hell, boy, it didn't need to. I was conducting that trial, wasn't I? Jury convicted Ira without evidence. I didn't see no need of mentioning it. I knew. That was enough. That money was took off Bob Harris, he was always packing a wad. And the money on Barry? Was took off Willoughby. Bobby Harris said so. He told Frank Lee, and Frank told me. I told Frank to keep his mouth shut about it. Willoughby was instantly killed, Bobby lived almost till they got into Salt Lick. Frank stopped the stage to see if there was anything he could do for the passengers, and that's when Bobby told him. The other 2 robbed him and Willoughby, he said, while the third man covered the stage with his gun. The third man had the money box. There ain't no use arguing, boy, Ira and Dave and Barry is all guilty as hell. Holly had been sitting by the desk, listening silently, saying many things with his eyes. Now he edged into the conversation. Sheriff Lander, I realize I'm still pretty much of a stranger here, bein' as I come to Salt Lick Range only about 6 weeks before the stage robbery. What did you come for? Lander put in softly. To buy myself a ranch here because I liked the territory, and later found the quarter circle star begging for a taker. And, stranger or no, seeing I'm so vitally concerned in this, I'd like to say something here. Yeah? Well, say on, Dave. I'd just like to say this, to go on record saying it. I never had a thing to do with that robbery. I'll take my oath on the Bible, if you like, and I respect the Bible. So do I. Lander leaned to slide open a drawer of his desk. He took out a good-sized Morocco-bound Bible and laid it before Holly. Let's see you do it. He stood there staring at Dave, and his indolent-seeming eyes had changed, held something deep and hard and menacingly challenging. Holly rose, laid his right hand palm down on the pebbled black leather, and looked steadily into Lander's unwinking gaze. I swear before my God that I had nothing to do with the robbery in which Ira and Barry Rip were shot. He removed his hand and dropped it to his side. Lander shook his head, reaching slowly to return the Bible to its drawer, his regard still intent on Holly. Hell, that beats me. I don't know, I've watched a hell's min of men taking oaths, good men and bad. I always thought I could read a man's face. Now, I don't know, I reckon I got to give you the benefit of the doubt, Dave, till you're proved a liar. When a man swears before his God, Holly said, that money taken off the stage, Sheriff, that $40,000 is mine and ranch payroll money. Lander said, I know. It's never been found, Dave, never a trace of it nowhere. Holly said, I know where it is. I've known for 3 days. Lander's sleepy eyes almost closed. Yeah? Tire hell. Where is it? Buried under the saddle room floor, in the barn, on the quarter circle star. Rip sucked in his breath. In our barn. How'd you find it? I seen a little heap of dry dirt on the floor, where none had ought to be. It had rained that day, the outside ground was all wet. I thought that was funny, I started looking, and come across a loose board, pried it up, and dug around a little. Buried under there in the dirt was the stage money box. Somebody'd been getting into it. I didn't even open it, I left it right there the way I found it. Lander asked, and why didn't you come in and tell me? I was waiting to see if Ira Rip would give out anything more before he died. Lander pursed his lips dubiously. Could be. Well, I'll tell you, Rip, I'll put Dave in a cell. I ain't saying I believe him, and I ain't saying I ain't. I've seen other men swear before their God, believe them, and found out they was lying. I can't be too fast about believing now. But I will do this, I'll give you a chance to unearth some proof. I'll give you 1 week. Dave said, how do you think he's going to dig up in a week what you couldn't dig up in a year? Lander said, hell, man, I don't know. But you got to reckon with this, I always believed on the evidence that Ira and Barry had to be guilty. I'm just a plain man, I got my faults and maybe I wasn't looking the right way. Rip believes you and Ira and Barry is all innocent. He'll go looking a different way. And I'll back him, if he runs into anything. I'll be siding him shoulder to shoulder. And I'll keep right on looking, too. That's all I can do. But, only a week. Holly protested. I know. But that's about all I'm going to have myself, Dave. Hell, do I have to remind you again that this whole range is still all heat up over this killing? If I stall the trial off more than a week, looking for further evidence when everybody believes I've got all the evidence any man needs, I'm going to have a mob on my hands. They'll bust down the doors and hang you higher than a cate, and I won't have a chance to stop them. I'll have my work cut out for me holding them quiet for a week. I still don't see how you can be telling the truth, don't see how Rip can find any contrary evidence. And if you don't, I got to hold you guilty, Dave. That's my last word. Rip turned away. His last word was for Holly. Keep your chin up, Dave. I got you into this, when you might have skinned out and laid low and saved yourself. I'll do something. I don't know how, but I'll do something. I tell you again, you'll never hang for a crime you didn't commit, Lander said to his back, before he could open the door. Wait outside, Rip. I'll lock Dave up, then we'll scoot out to the ranch and get that money box, before anyone knows I got Dave here. Be with you in a minute. They rode out to the quarter circle star, and found the money box exactly where Dave Holly said it was. The money box was empty. Lander took it with him. Together, in almost total silence, the two men rode back to Salt Lick. Rip went on alone up the one main street of the town, past the Blackjack and all the other business buildings, until he came to the farther edge of town, and a small 4-room cottage built several yards back from the board sidewalk. In front of the cottage was a strip of green grass and a path bordered with red and white spice pinks and blue lobelia, all characterless shades of gray and black in the moonlight. He walked up to the door and rapped, his gaze on the wide front window and the blank shelves within. Nothing was on any of the 3 shelves but a loaf of bread. Meg O'Hara's pies and donuts didn't last long in Salt Lick. Meg herself opened the door, and stood there big and broad, peering out at him, her black hair shining in the light from behind her, sudden welcome livening the severity of her broad and heavy face. "Rip, boy, you're back. Can't ye still come in without knocking, and this your home for nigh on to a year? You look beat out. I've got some fresh donuts and your favorite apple pie waiting for ye, come on in." Rip stepped inside, glancing about the room beyond. "Where's Cat Meg?" "Out in the kitchen seeing to the beef roast I've been cooking for ye. We looked for ye back today. They got Holly yet? Or don't ye know?" Rip walked over to a chair and sat down, took off his dusty hat and laid it on the floor, letting his arms fall limp on the arms of the chair. "John's locked him up in a cell. Dave isn't guilty, Meg." Meg shut the door, and walked slowly back to stand facing him. "Rip, boy, ye're the stubbornest man I ever knew since Sean O'Hara died. Why don't ye drop this foolishness and try to forget it? I tell ye to me and Cat what your old man and your brother may have been, it's you we're taken into the family, not them." Rip met her gaze levelly. "And I'm telling you for the 1000th time that I'll never marry Cat with anything like that hanging over me. I'll never marry Cat until I can prove that Dad and Barry had nothing to do with that robbery, and now I've got Dave to clear, too. With only a week to do it in before another innocent man dies." Meg quick anger flared, but before she could say anything more the kitchen door swung open, and Cat came swiftly before them, her face eager, her eyes bright with welcome at sight of Rip sitting there. He watched her as she came toward him, slim and supple as old Meg once might have been, black-haired and tall like Meg, but the rest of her was Sean O'Hara. The dark brown eyes, the clean plain mobile face, the stubborn temper and the hard will, all Sean O'Hara over again. Even Meg said so. Cat stooped over Rip and kissed him on the mouth, her hand closed on his forearm. "Rip. I'm so glad to have you back." He looked up at her, thinking how desirable she was, how badly he had wanted her and how long. He freed his arm from her grip, raised the arm, put it around her and drew her down onto the chair arm beside him. Meg said, "Did ye hear the young fool? He's still after proof, and now it's Dave Holly who's not guilty. The devil take it, boy, you think Cat wants to wait forever?" Cat said quietly, "Ma. Don't, please. You know we can't agree. There's no use. Please." Meg turned around and stamped out into the kitchen, her heavy face clouded with anger. As the kitchen door closed behind her mother, Cat said, "You haven't learned anything new that could help Rip?" Rip shook his head, where it lay against her shoulder. "No. Everything I've learned only makes it look worse." He told her, then, all that had transpired since he had left Salt Lick in answer to the warden's summons. And at the end, he looked up to see Meg standing in the kitchen doorway and realized that she'd been listening all along. She said nothing, but came into the room to place on the table heaped dishes of food, steaming savory beef and potatoes, fragrant brown donuts and the uncut apple pie. Cat said, "Come on and eat, Rip. You must be famished." He followed her to the table, she sat down opposite him and Meg lowered her bulk into a chair at the end of the table, facing them both. Rip silently began to fill his plate. Meg said, trying to exhibit unwanted patience, "Look, boy. Devil take it, why can't you be reasonable? Barry was always a wild young hellion, forever getting into one scrape after another. You've got to face that. Ira was a reckless old reprobate, de-ricking like a fish and rather gamble than eat when he was hungry." Cat interrupted, "Please, Ma. We've been over all that, and over it and over it." Meg said belligerently, "Yes, and we're going over it again. That boy's got to see reason, if I have to pound it into him myself. Barry and Ira and Dave Holly held up the stage, robbed the stage and the passengers, and killed both passengers. Harris and Willoughby. Ira and Barry are dead, Dave Holly will soon be. Why can't we accept tragedy with our chins up, and go on and live past it? It's what we've got to do sooner or later, tragedy comes to us all. You think it's been easy for me that Sean O'Hara got killed in a drunken fight at the mine? And me having to bring up my girl single-handed, baking sinkers and dough gads for cow nurses and pick slingers? I've held up my head, I've learned to forget. You can do the same." Rip knew what she meant. She didn't mention that the fight in which Sean was killed had been over a skittish light-moraled woman, long gone from Salt Lick Range. And Meg O'Hara hadn't forgotten. Rip said quietly, 3 men, as yet unknown and running loose on Salt Lick Range, killed 4 men, Meg, killed Harris, Willoughby, Barry, and Dad, and framed Dave Holly. You heard what I just told Kat. Dave isn't guilty, Meg. Meg sighed, running one hand deep into her thick black hair and leaving it there, leaning her head on it, her elbow on the table. It's no use arguing with ye. Maybe, when this week's up, and ye're convinced that there's no contrary evidence to find, you'll give up and be sensible. Ye'll have to, or give up Kat, by your own choice. Rip reached for another helping of potatoes. That's why I've got to win out. Meg, all of the reasons are big enough, but the biggest one's for Kat. When he rode away from the O'Hara cottage, the night was still young. Rip Campbell kept to the back alleys, grateful for the darkness, his mind worrying at the numerous dark facets of the bewildering situation. He thought of what Dave Holly had said in the ranch kitchen, about being in a tight. He muttered sardonically, he's in a tight. Hell, he doesn't even know what tight means. I got him to give himself up, when he could have slipped away and laid low. What if more planted evidence shows up to hang him? Somewhere deep inside him a mocking voice challenged, and what if he is guilty? What if all this smooth build-up is only the slyest trick one man ever put over on another? What was that payroll money box doing in the barn? Rip said vehemently, no. He's not guilty, I have to believe what I saw in his face. The deep-down voice continued an inexorable argument. How can you be sure it wasn't a lie you saw in his face? All of this has been done behind so smoothly lying a face that no suspicion has ever been aroused as to the identity of the third man. Would this lie be any smoother than the rest? Rip said, but I had to stop him from running away. That would have stamped him even more surely as guilty. I thought you were just telling yourself how he might have slipped away and laid low. But I was wrong, I wasn't thinking straight. He couldn't have laid low, not for long, not after what Dad said, and the warden spreading it everywhere. Half the country would have been looking for Dave. They'd have caught him sooner or later, mob wild, and hanged him. Just as they'll hang him now, if I don't dig up something. The deep-down voice said, it'll have to be good. Or someone will come forward with fresh evidence to cinch him, maybe several somebodies. Maybe 6 vigilantes, by God. Rip stared ahead into the night, feeling the chill crawl on his skin again. The 6 vigilantes. The 6 cowboys in the bunkhouse. Why hadn't they come to Dave Holly's aid when he was being beaten up and bound? When Lander and Rip had gone back to the ranch for the money box, the bunkhouse lights had been out. The boys had bedded down early as usual. Rip had told himself now that he would see them before another day was out. It couldn't be too important. It was really quite possible the boys hadn't heard a sound, possible that the vigilantes had left their horses some distance away and crept up to the house afoot. The more important thing now was to discover some evidence as to the identity of the 3 unknown men who had committed the robbery. If there are any 3 such men, the deep-down voice answered. The old man told you, dying, it was Holly. Not only his horse, not only his clothes. It was Holly's voice. I've always known it was Holly who shot me and Barry. But the law ain't caught up with him. I've got to tell now. And I'm telling you, boy, I'm begging you on my deathbed, don't go on the prod and stick your neck in a noose to even the score for me, Barry. You let the law take care of Dave Holly. And once the law's got him, maybe Dave will tell who the other 2 was. Rip said, my God, is it possible he can be guilty? The deep-down voice echoed, a long way off, as if it were sh ricking at its own daring. And maybe he isn't the only one who can really be guilty. Have you thought of that? Who are you to say that they couldn't rob a stage just because they were your father and your brother? What if, in trying to prove Holly innocent, you only prove all 3 of them guilty? Have you thought of that? Rip laughed, suddenly, not in mirth. In a tight. I can't even turn around. So I've got to go ahead. And if there's no opening, I've got to bull it through. The first man I want to talk to is Frank Lee. Rip turned into the main street of Salt Lick and prodded the sorrel into a little faster pace. He drew rein at last before a small slab cabin beyond the edge of town opposite from Meg O'Hara's. Frank and Don were still up. Lamplight glowed through the flour sacks over the windows. Rip dropped the sorrel's reins, stepped up to the door and knocked. Frank Lee opened the door and stood silhouetted against the lamplight, a long tough sinewed man with a long thin head and a turkey neck. His brown straggling whiskers, leathery face and squinting eyes were all the same color. He gaped at sight of Rip, then threw the door wide. "Well, hammer me down. Look who's here. Don. Come in, Rip. Me and Don were just having ourselves a little game of draw. Damn him, I caught him out on a limb with a bobtail flush and sawing the limb right out from under him. Set in and take a hand." Rip stepped into the cabin, seeing Don Bissell seated at the plank table, chair tilted back on its rear legs, cards held face down against his chest. Don, burly and bull stout, had been shotgun guard ever since Frank had been driving stage. They lived in the same cabin, shared their meals and recreations. No one could remember ever having seen one without the other. Don took one look at Rip's face, dropped his chair legs to all fours, and tossed his hand of cards into the discard. "Sit down, Rip. We heard the news. John got Holly yet?" "Shut the door, Frank." Frank closed the door, straddled an upended box, and with his foot shoved toward Rip the chair he himself had been using, the only other chair in the room. Rip said, "Holly's in jail. He gave himself up. He's made a sworn statement that he's not guilty." Don winked and leered. "Nah, he ain't guilty. Polecats don't make a stink, either," Rip said. "What do you mean by that?" Frank laughed. "Just what you think he does. We known all the time that Dave Holly was the third man. We seen that Mackinaw and the Blaze face that night, too. The Mackinaw Dave ain't wore since." Rip said, "Why haven't you told on him then? You said at Dad's trial you didn't know who the third man was." Don said, "We didn't want him took then. We been watching him, known he couldn't get away from us. We been laying low, waiting for him to lead us to that cashed money box." Rip said, "I don't believe you. You said at the trial, too, that you knew Dad and Barry were the other two. Maybe you believe that, but it isn't true. I came to ask you to help me get at the bottom of it." Don leaned forward, hands braced on the plank table, his bulky shoulders hunched. "We done got to the bottom of it. You might as well face up to it and stop beating your brains out over it. Your dad and Barry and Dave Holly pulled that job." Rip came out of his chair, both fists doubled. "Take that back or I'll knock you stem winding." Frank reared to his feet, long head thrust forward on his long neck, clamped a hand on Rip's shoulder and slammed him back into his chair. "Cut that out, boy. Don and me don't lie any man out of character," Don said. "We didn't tell all we knew at the trial, we didn't have to. The evidence done the trick. Your dad and Barry lying there shot up and with their masks still on told the whole story. We knew them masks, unusual like, they was. Cut out of stiff, shiny black oilcloth." Frank said, "Me and Don kept shut for your sake, kid. No use making it any worse than it was. This is the thanks we get." Don hadn't moved. His jaws had set till the muscles stood out, but he stayed where he was. Rip said to Frank Lee, "What else did you know?" "Look, kid," Don said quietly. "We'll fell you if you'll keep your shirt on. Pull any rough stuff, and you'll get hurt. Promise to listen peaceable, and we'll spill all we know. Maybe it'll help you to take the whole thing on the chin and forget it." Rip said, "All right. I'll meet you halfway. I'll keep my ears open and my mouth shut." Don leaned toward him earnestly. "Well, when they'd hauled the money box off the stage that night, Holly kept back away, holding the gun on us. The one that reached for the box had holstered his shooting iron. He was taking it to Holly. The one that came up to the stage still had his smoke wagon out. He says, 'Need any help, Dad?' The one taking the box to Holly says, 'Nope. Tain't heavy, Barry. I can handle it.' Holly says, impatient like, 'Get a move on, Rip.' The one with the box says, 'Coming, Dave. Catch it.' He handed the box over, and turned back. Frank put in, 'Then I whipped up the horses, and Don reared up and let him have it. The two that had robbed Harris and Willoughby fired into the stage and turned and run. I pulled out my hog leg and got them both. By this time the one on the horse, the one that had taken the box, Holly, was blazing away at me and Don. He got me first, and I dropped my gun. It was all I could do to hang on," Don said, "then he got me and I flopped. The horses was going lickety-split by now. He kept firing after us, but the stage was all he could hit. We just crouched there and waited to get out of range. All we wanted to do about then was get out of there, and we got. I was hit. I knew Frank was hit. We didn't know yet that Willoughby was dead and Harris dying." Frank said, "Harris and Willoughby was both well knew and well liked in Sat Lick, Bob Harris especially, him being a businessman. Nobody on this range is going to cool down over that robbery until we hang the third man who helped kill him. Third man, hell, Rip cut in. None of the three has been caught yet. I wish you'd told all that at the trial. It could have saved Dad a year in prison. He might still be alive right now. Don scowled and blinked. Saved him? Are you plumb loco, kid? Rip hitched his chair toward the plank table. Can't you see it, man? What you've just said is proof that it couldn't have been Dad and Barry and Dave who held up the stage. Do you think if it had really been them they'd have named names like that where you and Don could hear? It's the last thing they'd have done. But it's exactly what three other men would have done to try to frame Dad and Barry and Dave. And it wasn't too damn smart, either. Don said slowly, maybe it was smart, if you're really on the right track. Your dad and Barry had never done nothing like that before. Being excited, they might forget and say things just like what we heard them say. Frank said. It was Ira and Barry and Dave Holly, Rip. I wish there could have been some other way about it. I wish we could have knew something that would have helped you to start to begin to prove it, some way. Rip said, you've done it. Frank blinked. Eh? What? Done what? Given me something to start on. The men who staged that robbery knew you and Don, they knew Dad and Barry and Holly, knew the way you'd all react. They couldn't have planned it so neatly otherwise. And if they knew you that well, you must know them. Think, Frank. Think. Wasn't there the least thing familiar about any of them, if you put aside all idea that they were Dad and Barry and Dave? Don said slowly, wait, there was something. I've always been so sure before that it was Ira and Barry and Dave. But when you put it that way, there was something that I thought was kind of odd for your old man to have done, no matter how excited he was. When? Rip cut in. When the men first came up to the stage. Or after they'd got the money box? Don said. It was after he'd taken the money off Bob Harris and Joe Willoughby. He'd taken it off Willoughby first, that wad he gave to Barry, heck. Excuse it. I'll start over. All right, now. Here's three men. They hold up the stage with guns. Robber number one, the hairpin in the Mackinaw, he don't leave the saddle, he sits pat with his gun leveled. Frank said, then the other two gets down and comes toward the stage, where me and Don is waiting with our hands up. They orders Joe and Bob to get out the coach, and Joe and Bob gets out. Robber number two frisks Joe Willoughby and hands the dough to robber number three. He frisks Bob Harris and sticks that wad in his own jeans. Don said, then he orders Joe and Bob to get back into the coach, and they get back. Frank said, then robber number one says to get the money box. Number two holsters his gun and reaches for the box, which I'm handing down to him. Number three is still standing there with his gun on us, like Don told you. Hold on a minute, Frank, Don put in. You're passing up the thing that I thought looked funny. He grinned at Rip apologetically. Maybe it don't amount to nothing, but it sure looked queer, with them birds in such a hurry, for him to forget hisself that way and take time to do that. Frank's long face wrinkled in a scowl. I ain't sure I know what you mean, Don said, I guess I never did mention it to you, I just put it out of my head and didn't pay it no mind. But with Rip bringing all this up, I got to thinking of it again. Putting it into words, though, it sounds so kind of puny. Rip said, never mind that, Don, any little thing could be important. What did he do? Well, just as he started to reach up for the money box, he stopped deliberate, hauled a plug out of his pocket and bit off a quid. Couldn't he have waited after he'd taken the box to number one? Or after the stage was gone? But no, he had to have a chew right then. Looked like he was so plumb excited he didn't think what he was doing at all. Frank said, sure. I remember that. He just complete and utterly forgot himself. Then he seen me staring at him, and he give a kind of start, rammed the plug back in his pocket and grabbed the box quick. And afterwards, I got to thinking, Don said. And I couldn't remember your old man chewing tobacco none, Rip said, he never did. He never chewed tobacco in his whole life. He smoked cigars. Frank said, reckon you better go on a still hunt, Rip, for all the men in Salt Lick that chaws tobacco. Rip said, no. I want to find the man who used to chew, and quit suddenly about a year ago. Don said, jumping Judas. You've got me half believing your way now. Me and Frank will help. We can fool around so slick and sly nobody'll catch on to what we're up to. What have we got to lose? Rip got to his feet and shoved the chair back toward Frank Lee. All right, go to it. I need all the help I can get. I'll drop in every night and we'll compare notes, Don said pessimistically, still, a really slick hombre would keep right on chewing, wouldn't he? Knowing that to stop off short might be a dead giveaway? Then he saw the look on Rip's face, and added hastily. But we'll go looking, Rip. We'll look good. Maybe that's just the one way he'll slip. The slickest of them slips somewhere, Rip said as he turned toward the door. That's a prayer, Donnie boy, that's a prayer. Chapter 3. As he rode back across town to his room at Meg O'Hara's, Rip tried to recall all the little angles he might not have given serious consideration up to now. Was there anything stemming either from Bob Harris or Joe Willoughby that could have any significant bearing? When he reached the cottage he found Meg gone to bed and Kat waiting up for him. He stretched out on the red plush sofa with his head in Kat's lap and asked her what she thought about it. Kat's brown eyes gazed into space, as she smoothed his forehead with slow fingers. About Joe and Bob, Rip? How could there be? I don't know. I've been remembering that it was Bob Harris himself who let it out about the payroll money for the ranches and mines being due on that stage. Frank was mad as hell when he found it out, but it was too late then. Kat's fingers went still on his forehead. Yes, I remember. And he was even madder after the robbery. He said Harris had practically invited himself to get killed. He was right. If Bob hadn't talked too much, no one would have known of the money shipment, there wouldn't have been any robbery. But how did Bob find out? Frank was always tight-mouthed about valuable cargo. He never told Bob, never told anybody. Kat's hand slid down the side of his cheek and held it there. We might as well get it all out in the open, Rip. Ira told Bob. How did Dad know about it? Ira had been gambling at the blackjack. He owed the house over $700. He told Bob he was a little short of ready cash, but there was a lot of money coming in on the stage, some of it was for his personal use, and he'd pay up then. Bob said he wasn't worrying, Ira's credit was good. When did this happen? About a week before the robbery. Then a couple of nights later Bob Harris spilled it, right there at the bar. Bob was a good egg, everybody liked him, but he had an awful big mouth, he never could keep anything himself. Rip said so he had to brag that he was going to Red Bend, and would be coming back on the stage loaded with 40,000 iron men. Who told you, Kat? Cal Quen. Kat began automatically smoothing his forehead again. He was right there behind the bar, of course, and heard it all. He privately called Bob all kinds of a fool, and Bob didn't mention it again, but the damage was done. How's Cal come to tell you? He used to room here, Rip. The room you have now. After Bob died and Zachary took over for the debt, Zachary offered Cal the room Bob had over the saloon. Zachary preferred to stay on in his cabin. He'd paid for it with gold he'd scratched from the hillside and he was fond of it. Rip sat up, slid his arm around her and pulled her close, her head against his shoulder. I can't see anything much in that. Only more in Dad's favor. If he figured on robbing the stage, why broadcast it? Unless it would be to cover up, so the list of people knowing about the money wouldn't be too narrow. And Bob couldn't have double-crossed him. Kat said, well, that isn't impossible. There didn't have to be only 3 men in on it. There could have been 4, or 5 or 6. Words milled in Rip's head, 6 men, 6 cowboys, 6 vigilantes, 6 men. He said, and all of them, those who did it, covering and lying so smoothly that nobody's ever suspected them. Heck, it could be the next man you meet on the street. It could be the boys at the Quarter Circle Star, it could be Don Bissell or Frank Lee, it could be anybody. Who was there in the blackjack that night, when Bob talked too much? Cal said there was hardly anyone there. Just a couple of boys from the White Horse Spread, 3 drifters that dropped in once in a while from Red Bend, Penny Coates, the town barfly, and Sam Wright. Rip thought, Sam Wright again. Was Sam cropping up too often? He rose suddenly, drawing Kat up with him. I'm going to bed. I'm too tired to think any more. Kiss me good night, honey. He wondered as he went slowly to his own room, was she drawing closer to him, or receding ever farther away, soon to vanish forever beyond his reach? He couldn't think that one out either. There wasn't any answer. He stayed on the edge of sleep for a long time, wearily trying to put the disjointed stray fragments together. Sam Wright's notable recurrence into the scene. Harris talking too much, the look on Dave's face and the oath on the Bible, the man who'd carelessly taken a chew of tobacco. The money box buried under the barn. 6 cowboys who'd failed to rush to their boss's defense. And 6 vigilantes. He muttered last, thickly, half asleep, hell, there were 6 of them, not 3. They were all there in the kitchen tonight, shoving Dave around, shutting the last mouth, as they thought, the last donger to themselves. They sold themselves down the river when they did that, if I can only ferret 'em out, in time. The next day Rip rode out to the Quarter Circle Star, and learned nothing that did any good. Mike Dillon said in consternation, "We never heard a thing, Rip. Hell running how _ could we? With Skeet banging away at that darn Jew's harp?" Rip said, "And all of you were right here in the bunkhouse all evening?" "Sure was. Oh, Roy and Beetle was out for a few minutes, heard the horses stamping in the barn. But nothing was wrong, they didn't see nobody around." Rip rode back to Salt Lick. The Six Vigilantes must have been very quiet, he thought. Still, a twanging mouth harp could drown a lot of other sounds, a mouth harp and Mike Dillon's bull roar of laughter. For 2 days after that he went on his still hunt. The first day he learned nothing. Don Bissell and Frank Lee had the same results to report. It was a different story the next night when they pooled their gleanings. Rip had listed several men who chewed and hadn't abandoned the habit, among them Cal Queen and Mike Dillon. Frank said, "Well, we ain't slighting nobody. We're taking them all in. Rick Zachary never uses tobacco in any form. Martin Thomas chews snuff. Dave Holly used to chew, but he quit a long time ago because it didn't taste good no more. He took to cigarettes." Don looked at Rip meaningfully. "I dug me up a man who quit chewing about a year ago because his missus was always complain about the nasty habit." Rip said, "Who?" Don grinned. "Sam Wright. And Sam's been saying here and there, not right lately though, that Zachary had all the luck, said he wished he'd have had the chance to loan Rick $26,000. Rip stared at him. "I've been thinking about that, Don. Sam's been saying a lot of things, hasn't he?" "Oh, you'd heard that?" "Yes. Just today. From Cal Queen." Don said, "Martin Thomas told me." Rip thought, "I'm going to see John Lander." He didn't say it. He went on back to Meg O'Hara's. Chapter 4. For 4 days then Rip drove himself distracted running down wild leads that led nowhere. He spent so much time covertly studying the crepe festoon document on the blackjack wall that he learned every word of it by heart, until he could see it as clearly in his mind's eye as if it were before him. He talked endlessly with Cal Queen and Martin Thomas, learned no more than he already knew. A less stubborn man might have given up in despair. 6 days of his week of grace were gone. He hadn't seen Dave Holly or John Lander since the day of his return to Salt Lick. That evening of the 6th day he told Cat O'Hara, "There's nothing more to learn. I have to think it out, or day after tomorrow Dave dies." Cat said, "John was right, Rip. The men are getting restless, impatient with John for not bringing Dave to trial and getting it over." Rip said, "I know. I heard them on the street today. They can't understand what he's waiting for, when he's got all the evidence he needs against Dave. He said they'd figure that way. I've got to see John tomorrow night, it's my last day of grace." He shut himself into his room to think. To think largely, in desperation, of Dave Holly swinging at the end of a rope. Rip stayed locked in his room for 22 hours, refusing food or sleep. The next night he emerged haggard and drawn-faced and went directly to John Lander's office. Lander received him without question or comment, and waved him to a chair. Rip refused the chair. "I'll keep my feet, I have to stay awake. I'm on the trail of something. I ought to be, I've about thought myself crazy. John, there's something wrong with that paper Bob Harris made out to Rick Zachary, but I can't figure what it is yet." Lander's red face showed nothing but a mild pity. "Where did you get that wild idea? What could be wrong with it? And what's that got to do with Dave Holly? Hell, boy, are you losing your mind?" Rip said, "A few times I've felt like it. But look here, John. I've come to some solid conclusions. There were 6 men in on that robbery, 3 who took care of the minor chores such as hiding the money box and whatnot, and 3 who did the actual job. They were the 6 vigilantes who tied Dave up and left him for me to finish." Lander said, "Sit down and let me buy you a drink, boy, you're thinking yourself into a fever." Rip ignored the interruption. "The 3 who did the actual robbing and killing are the only ones we need to consider right now. Once we get them, we can haul in the other 3. Think this over. No robber gang has been hanging around Salt Lick Range. This is the first robbery and killing we've ever had. There hasn't been any trouble since. Yet that money was cached in our barn. Dave stumbles onto it. The money disappears. Maybe it was already gone, Rip, Dave didn't look to see. I'll bet you anything it wasn't. Remember that dry heap of dirt that caught Dave's attention if the money was gone? Why was anybody poking around here? To make sure it hadn't been disturbed, of course. Lander said, hell, boy. For the first time you're making sense. Go on. That was a damned clever robbery, planned for a long time, planned to the last detail. Planned by men we knew, men who had lived among us so long as good and square men that they were above suspicion. Object? One big haul, all of the 3 ringleaders set for life, and never step off the narrow road to make any of them suspect. Lander's sleepy eyes were watching him intently. Keep going, you're still making sense. The 3 chore men might have thought the main object of that holdup was the money box. It wasn't. It was Bob Harris' life. Eh? You going crazy again? There's no sense to that. Oh, yes there is. Who did Bob's death set up for life in Clover with a capital C? Cal Queen, Martin Thomas, and Rick Zachary. They own the Blackjack jointly. Rick took Cal and Martin into partnership the week after Bob died. Did you know that? Lander's hushed voice dropped nearly to a whisper. I didn't, I don't think anybody else does. How did you find it out? From our town lawyer, on my promise of sworn secrecy. Martin Thomas made out the document, but the lawyer said it was all clear and legal. And Martin Thomas made out that paper on the Blackjack wall, if we knew the truth. I'd bet anything on it. Get Dave Holly in here, will you, John? Lander slid off his favorite perch, his desk, and went out. He came back shortly with Holly in tow. Rip began firing questions at Holly the minute he was inside the door. Dave, where were you living when the robbery was pulled? Why, in the old Ferris cabin, over beyond Meg O'Hara's, Rip said. Thomas lives there now. How'd you come to get so drunk that night, Dave? You've never been much of a drinking man, have you? Holly grinned sheepishly. No. That's why I plowed under so easy that night. But I had company, and I was damned if I was going to let him out-drink me. He did, though. He had to nigh carry me home. Somebody you met in the Blackjack? No, he come by the cabin and invited me. I told him afterwards never to ask me again, though, I couldn't take it. Rip said sharply, who was it? Why, a nice pleasant fella from over Star Hill. Sam Wright. Rip's gaze flicked to Lander. So? We have 4 of 'em tagged. Martin, Cal, and Rick, the leaders. Sam Wright one of the chore men. 4 down, and 2 to go. Holly said, why, that's plumb foolish. Rip said, is it? Listen. Cal and Martin came here and got themselves solid with Bob Harris. Bob said Cal was the best barman he'd ever had. Martin Thomas stands ace high because he's really a square gambler who won't tolerate any crooked work. Who would ever suspect them? They get all set here, in solid with the whole range, then what happens? Rick Zachary drifts in, that's what. And begins digging around. Pretty soon he's bringing dust and nuggets into town. He likes everybody and everybody likes him, but nobody can find out where his mine is. Then Harris gets into some kind of pinch. He borrows $26,000 from the nice old prospector. That's a lot of coin to dig out of the hills, where no gold was ever found before. Lander said gently, gold is where you find it, boy. Maybe. Maybe Rick put it there to find, too. How did Bob ever get into a pinch like that? The Blackjack's a moneymaker. Bob was always lousy with cash. Lander said, but that paper's all fair and square, boy. That's Bob's real signature on it. Yes. But was it like that when Bob signed it? Did Bob know what he was signing? There's something wrong with that document, John, and I'm going to find out what it is. I don't care how much hell I raise. The week's up. What have I got to lose? I'm going after Martin Thomas. Yeah? When? The minute the saloon's closed and he's in his cabin. And you remember. You said you'd back me. Lander's sleepy eyes blinked. Yeah, I'll back you, sure. If you find out anything worth salt. Better come on back to your cell, Dave, and say your prayers. There ain't no telling what this night will bring. When the lamp winked on in Thomas's cabin, Rip came striding out of the brush across the road where he had been waiting. He shoved open the door without knocking, locked it behind him and thrust the key into his pocket. Thomas, who had just removed his hat and tossed it aside, turned to look with inquiring eyes and raised brows. He was a big man, by several pounds and 2 inches bigger than Rip. He said mildly, well, company is always welcome. But don't you think you're being a trifle over-enthusiastic? Rip moved toward him, hands swinging loose at his sides. He was not wearing his gun. Thomas never carried a gun. Rip said, "You and I are going to talk, Martin." "Yes? What about?" "About the stage robbery you and Cal and Rick pulled, with the help of Sam Wright and a couple others." Thomas smiled. "Cal was on duty here in the saloon that night. If I remember correctly, Rick was off prospecting in the hills." Rip said, "Excuses won't go down anymore, Martin. You've been slick, but you've played out your string. You had plenty of time to call Rick in for the robbery. He had plenty of time to slide back to the hills again, before he drifted into town and put on the big act of being so astounded to find the saloon his property." Thomas laughed aloud. "Rip, if this is meant to be amusing, you've succeeded. I find it highly entertaining, but a trifle silly." Rip plowed on blindly, riding his bluff for all it was worth. "I've been inquiring around, Martin, and I've learned things. I know you sent one of the Quarter Circle Star boys to call Rick in, the day before the robbery. I know Rick Zachary first came to Salt Lick to join you and Cal Queen. I know he never found any gold in these hills, he planted it there. I know you maneuvered Bob Harris into a corner, and persuaded him to borrow money from Zachary." Thomas was standing erect now, watching Rip quietly. There was no hint of alarm on his face. He said, "You seem to know a great deal, for a man who knows nothing." Rip said, "I know you made out that document that hangs on the blackjack wall, and I know it's crooked. Bob Harris never knew what he was signing. I know you and Rick Zachary and Sam Wright held up the stage, after Sam got Dave Holly drunk so you could swipe his horse and clothes. You were the man in the Mackinaw. Sam Wright was the man who took the money box, and forgot himself and bit off a quid before he took it." Thomas was watching him carefully now, but still with no sign of alarm. He looked only like a man who is somewhat amazed and wholly puzzled. Rip plowed doggedly on. "I know some of the Quarter Circle Star boys were doing your chore work. You paid them off, and had them cash the money box under the barn. They never knew the score, never knew your main object in that holdup was to kill off Bob Harris so you three would be set for life. I doubt that even Sam Wright knew that." Thomas said, "You see what a logical and believable story a man can build up out of circumstantial evidence, Rip. It has hanged many an innocent man." Rip said, "I know that you made out a document taking you and Cal Queen in with Rick Zachary as joint owners of the Black Jack. I admitted before, you've been slick, all of you. You've all made slips here and there, and I've picked 'em up, but you made the biggest mistake of your life when you framed Dad and Barry and Dave Holly to keep your own skirts clear. That's going to hang the lot of you, Martin," Thomas said, "like a man whose long-suffering patience is being severely tried. Nothing's going to hang anybody, but Dave Holly. If you have any brains, you might use them. If..." He stopped and stood listening. There had been a sound of scuffling feet outside. It did not come again. Rip ignored it. "What were you going to say?" Thomas looked at him. "I was going to say, if you have any brains you might use them. If everything you have just said in your unwarranted accusation were true, what does it profit you? I could knock holes in it from beginning to end. It takes proof to hang a man, Rip, the kind of proof that stands against Dave Holly. And nowhere and in no way could you ever find a shred of proof to back up your silly tissue of lies." Rip said, "No. There's no proof. You're going to admit it. If I have to beat the head off your shoulders, you're going to admit it." Thomas said, "Like a man whose patience is played out, see here, Rip, I'm getting a little tired of this. Kindly go on home so I can get to bed." The sound of scuffling feet came again from outside. There was a slight rasping noise mingled with it, as if someone had brushed against the outer wall near the window. There was only one window, only one door. Thomas smiled faintly. "My bodyguard, on the job. You didn't know I kept a bodyguard, did you? I often carry large sums of money, you know. Cal Queen and Sam Wright. They keep a watch over me, especially when I come home at night. That is the only personal connection they have with me, Rip. And now, will you kindly get along with you, before I call Sam and Cal in and have you thrown out?" Rip said, "You heard me." "Yes, and you heard me. I can knock you down and drag you out if I have to," Rip said. "I have the key." Thomas laughed. He moved with incredible flash, bringing up a doubled fist no harder than an iron ingot. Rip stumbled back against the wall, half stunned from the unexpected punch. The room whirled and his eyes drooped shut. He found himself wondering how a man who spent his time behind a card table could pack so much power. Chapter 5. Then he pulled himself together. He heard the shuffle of feet outside again, near the window, in the street. It would take more than two men to make that much sound. He forced his eyes open and flicked a glance at the window. The cracked green blind was down, but it hung awry. A man couldn't see out into the night, but anyone outside the window could peer in. Rip dragged himself out of that split second of daze, and launched himself. He feinted left and right to avoid Thomas's follow-up, and slipped deftly into the center of the floor. He was ready for the gambler this time, and as Thomas came within range, Rip flicked out with his left, planting a sharp right to the pit of Thomas's stomach. The gambler grunted and countered with a bludgeon right to the side of Rip's head. The blow hurt, it set Rip's ears to ringing. Again, in a glimmer of time for thought, Rip marveled at Thomas's physical condition. The gambler's flesh had the solid resilience of a bag of sand, he seemed just about as impervious to punishment. The two sparred for a moment, then Rip saw an opening, and lashed out with a left hook. Thomas ducked to take the punch high on the head, and Rip felt the bones of his hand shatter, felt his elbow go numb. He winced insensibly, and Thomas came in like lightning to take advantage of the injury. Rip forced a clinch, to save himself, and Thomas changed tactics swiftly. He applied a crushing arm hold with the patent intent of punishing Rip's injured left hand, forced the hand between his knees and began to grind it between his powerful bones. Rip caught a sobbing breath, half blinded by the excruciating pain, and for the first time since the start of the fight Thomas spoke. "You asked for it, Rip. And, by God, you're going to get it." Rip struck out blindly and ineffectually with his right, then called on reason in spite of the pain in his hand. He suddenly threw his weight forward to retain his balance, lifted his left foot, and brought his boot heel down hard on the gambler's toes. Thomas gasped in pain, and relaxed his hold involuntarily. Rip broke free. "That evens us up, Martin, eh? My hand and your foot." Thomas made no answer, beyond a malevolent glare. The noise was louder outside now, and somewhere somebody muttered something, someone near the window answered. Rip was no more than half conscious of the sounds, and Thomas was too enraged to hear them at all. He started slowly toward Rip, moving with a limp. Rip's left arm was rapidly turning numb to the shoulder, and he kept it crooked high in front of his face. The two circled, and Rip darted into close quarters, feinting with the useless left, lashing out with his right. The blow landed on Thomas's cheekbone, and again Rip forced him into a clinch. "Break clean," Thomas snarled. "Clean?" Rip echoed. "What do you know about fighting clean?" The voice sounded near the window outside again, this time clearly enough to be understood. "Keep away from there. I'll have no mob violence. He ain't hurtin' Thomas, yet." Somebody tried the door. Insensibly Rip relaxed his vigilance. Thomas hadn't heard Lander's voice, he hadn't heard anything. He was in a maniacal fury, and he drove upward with a vicious knee to the groin. Rip staggered back, numbed by agony, only half feeling the rain of rights and lefts that battered into his face. He blacked out for an instant, and came to his senses only as he fell over backwards. Lander's voice sounded outside again, a fist banged on the wall by the window, the door rattled. Lander barked, "I told you to keep away from there, damn you. We ain't had no mobs in Salt Lick, we ain't going to have none." Thomas had to hear that. He whirled and looked at the window, and a slow smile crossed his face. Well. So I've got some protection. Cal and Sam have called in the sheriff. As if I needed them. He turned, and moved slowly toward Rip, still smiling, still limping, but supremely confident, ready to deliver a leisurely coup de grace. Rip's body ached intolerably, but for that minute in which Thomas's attention had been distracted, he had lain there doubled against the wall, aware of his strength returning, thanking his lucky star that the gambler's knee hadn't struck squarely. With a tremendous effort of will, he drove the cobwebs from his brain, and dragged his eyelids wider apart. He rolled over on his back, with a groan of pain he had no need to simulate. Thomas slid back. He said mockingly, "Oh, no you don't. I think we'll just clean this up right now. And John can slap you in jail for assault and battery." The gambler snatched up the nearest heavy homemade chair. He swung it high, shattering it against the cabin wall, caught up one of the clumsy stout legs for a club, and advanced for the kill. Rip lay watching him with slit eyes. At the instant Thomas bent low to bring the bludgeon down on the boy's skull, Rip lashed up with his boot heels, with all the remaining strength he could summon. Both feet landed. Rip felt more than he heard the result of the double blow. He felt Thomas's nose crumple, felt the grit of bone as the gambler's big white teeth splintered and the jaw gave. Thomas cried out hoarsely as he went down. Rip relaxed to the edge of insensibility. But half heard, half sensed, he caught the sounds from outside again. A fist, then something heavier than any fist, crashed against the door. Lander shouted an angry command. An angrier voice replied defiantly. Several voices. The hell with you. We're going in there. We'll kill the son. We'll tear him into dull ribbons. Lander shouted again through the window. Open up in there. Break it up, Martin. Give up peaceably, and you've got a chance. I can't hold these boys much longer. Rip pried his lids apart and tried to get to his feet. His stomach muscles were drawn into a tight cramp. He turned onto his side, and managed to lift himself to an elbow. The room was an unholy mess. The shattered chair was strewn about. In falling, Thomas had overturned the table into a mass of shattered dishes. Some of the shards had cut into his cheek. A pot of cold beans had overturned and spilled its contents into the one unbroken bowl. Thomas lay on his face on the floor 10 feet away. Blood gushed from his mashed nose and lacerated mouth, but his eyes were open and glaring with venom as he painfully lifted his head and turned his gaze on Rip. Rip said softly, "You heard that, Martin. They're after you, not me. Half the men in town know the whole dirty setup by now. Do you talk, or do I hold John back and let the mob take you?" Thomas spat blood and gasped, "Go to hell." Rip felt along the wall behind him. He hooked the fingers of his right hand over a stud brace, and pulled himself to his feet. For an instant he tottered precariously, still unable to draw himself completely erect. He took a series of duck-like steps toward the gambler, slipped in a pool of blood, and fell across Thomas's shoulders. The gambler roused himself in an effort to throw off the boy's weight. The battering on the door was devilishly steady now, the shouting outside was almost continuous. The door panels began to splinter. Rip drove downward with all his strength with the elbow of his injured left arm. The blow landed just below Thomas's ear. The gambler collapsed and lay flat on the floor, cursing in pain, as Rip drove his right hand into the bleeding pulp of a face. Rip was shouting now, to make himself heard above the din from outside. "They can have you, Martin. So help me God, I'll give you to them, if you don't talk. Talk, damn you. What was there in that paper?" The word blanked out on his tongue. He crouched there with his mouth half open, hearing the door shattering. A moment of almost painful clarity cut through his brain, like the opening of a camera shutter. He saw the document hanging on the blackjack wall, the exact position of the words, the meaning of that position which had eluded him so long. There was a flash of clarity in the gambler's brain, too. There was a chance for a man in a jail cell. Cells had been broken open before. But there could be no chance for any man whose flesh had been riddled by a senseless mob, and he craved the safety of the cell now, the protection of the law, until the men he would not name could band together and set him free. Martin rolled over and tried to sit up, he couldn't make it. He rolled again, and got to hands and knees, head hanging. He forced the head to lift, and as he crouched there, blood dripping from his chin, the door crashed in. A crowd of men poured into the room behind it, armed with clubbed guns and knotted sticks. Lander was in the lead, both arms spread, forcing them back. "Damn it, John." One of them swung his hickory axe handle in threat. "Get out of the way. We'll rush you." Thomas stared at them and spoke thickly through puffing lips. "Keep 'em back. It's your job, Lander, you're the law. Keep 'em back. I'll talk." Rip shouted wildly, "I've got it. I've got it." He leaned toward the gambler. "Martin. Talk fast. Who, or what, was Bob Harris' beloved Sal?" Thomas closed his eyes. The stillness of the room was loud in his ears. The stillness of men waiting. He said slowly, "It was his Hog Leg. His Colt revolver with the 7-inch barrel. Short for salvation." Then Martin Thomas talked. And what seemed a long time afterward, Lander said softly, "That was a right good show you put on, boys. Almost scared me a time or two. You can drop the clubs now. We got to haul Martin to his cell. Hell, we got a few others to pick up, too." Chapter 6. It was after daybreak when Rip came again to Meg O'Hara's cabin. Both Meg and Kat were up waiting for him, now. He had stopped at Lander's to bathe and make himself presentable. He was sore and conscious of a few assorted aches, but not much evidence of the fight showed on the surface. Meg opened the door, and he walked in grinning. He went straight to Kat, and took her in both arms, ignoring the bandaged left hand. Meg said, "Ring out the wedding bells, Eh? Rip turned to look at her, his right arm still around Kat. Any old time. It's all over. It was a honey while it lasted, Meg said. Sean would have loved it. We heard a good deal from the boys already. Kat said, we heard how Martin jockeyed Bob Harris into a tight place, holding out on the funds at the blackjack, then got Bob to borrow of Rick. But it isn't clear what he did to that paper, Rip. Rip took his arm from about the girl, and shoved his right hand in his pocket. I've got it, here. See for yourself. He unfolded the document and handed it to Kat. Meg crowded at her daughter's shoulder, following the words carefully from beginning to end. To whom it may concern. This is to certify that Rick Zachary has on this day loaned me the sum of $26,000 bucks. As security for so generous a loan, I hereby make him silent partner in my beloved saloon, which is to become his sole property in case it ever proves impossible for me to pay back this loan. Signed. Bob Harris, witness. Cal Queen. Rip said, it was originally only a prankish joke, that was what Bob Harris thought. He wasn't very far in the red. He borrowed $600 from Zachary, offered to give Rick his note. Rick laughed at it. Cal grinned, and told Bob that Rick ought to have some security. He said, give him half interest in your beloved Sal, Bob. Martin can draw up the paper. That ought to do it. Harris thought it was pretty funny, and told Martin to get busy with the writing. Kat said, his beloved Sal? What in the world? Rip looked down at the paper held in the girl's fingers. Bob's revolver. Martin and Cal worked on that for months, to spring it just right. Started in by calling the gun Bob's Salivator, then added the beloved, then shortened it to Sal. But only for Bob's benefit, never where anyone else might overhear, and never too often, lest Bob start using the term himself. After Bob was killed, they conveniently forgot all about it. Meg said, but one of the boys said Bob had paid back that loan the next week. One of the boys that heard Martin spill everything to John. He was too excited to make sense. Rip said, no. He was right. Martin and Rick were both crooks. Meg, that gold Rick salted to find in the hills was left from a former robbery, taken from a prospector they killed. Martin was an expert forger. He made an exact copy of that paper. When Bob paid Rick back his $600, Martin handed the forged copy over to Bob. In front of Martin and Cal, and Rick, Bob tore up the copy and threw it into a spittoon. Then they all forgot about it. Martin kept the original paper, added a dollar mark, a figure 2, a comma and a 0 to the 600, added 2 O's and an N to the Sal, and tucked it away for future use. Meg muttered, the devil was too clever to live. Rip laid his arm around Kat's shoulders. He isn't alive anymore, Meg, that's why I didn't get here before. John held the trial right there at the jail. Dave and I saw them hanged, all 7 of them. Some of it wasn't easy to take, the boys from the Quarter Circle Star. Kat said, 7. Rip's arm tightened across her shoulders. Yes. Martin, Rick Zachary, Cal Queen, Sam Wright, and the 3 from the ranch, Roy and Skeet and Beetle. Kat stared down at the document in her fingers, and began to tear it slowly across and across. Then you were right about the 6 Vigilantes. And the box buried in the barn. Meg said, who was them 6 that beat Dave up? Sam, Martin, Cal and Rick circled out and beat me to the ranch, Meg. Beetle had already warned Martin that Dave had found the box, had taken the money out and delivered it to Martin to split. So they figured they had to get rid of Dave. That's right. They sneaked up afoot. Martin whistled a signal. Beetle said he heard the horses stamping, and he and Roy went out. Skeet covered them with his mouth harp. Martin didn't leave out a thing when he talked, Meg. He figured on breaking jail. But John slapped him in a cell and hauled the others in, with half the town to help the good work along. I guess we can start that forgetting, Meg, Meg said, praise be. Where are you 2 young ones going to live after the wedding? You can have the cottage if you want it. Oh. And what's going to become of the blackjack now? Rip sighed in content. Dave's going to take it over. Rick got it by fraud, and Bob Harris had no heirs. He looked down at Kat. We're going to live on the Quarter Circle Star. Kat glanced up quickly from the shreds of paper she still held. You're buying it back, Rip. No. I couldn't, could I? I'm broke. Dave's making me a present of it. He says, after all, he got it so cheap, and he's lived there a year, what he paid wasn't even rent. Meg said, and there's no paying the debt to a man who saved your life. Rip said, that wasn't mentioned. Meg yawned and turned to leave the room. I've got to get me a nap. The boys will be late getting their pies and donuts this time. But I can't help it. I've had enough excitement for one day. Rip and Cat stood in silence and watched the heavy figure going away from them, watched the door close behind her. Cat whirled, and raised both arms, to clasp them about Rip's neck. The end. More work by the author. Can I send you Wrangler for free? More work by the author. California Toothpick. Bone Orchard. Crowbait. Tin Horn. Cowpoke. Beets Dying. Out and Out. Bangtail. Blue Blazes. 5 Beans in the Wheel. Piebald. Pinto. Hog Leg. Noose Fever. Pan Out. Pack Iron. Blood Sign. Greenhorn. Tooth and Nail. Boot Hill Bullyrag. All Fired. Big Old Adios.